These are young people who are involved with the Coolidge community through our prestigious academic scholarship, and we're very glad that they are with us today. Two guests who I also want to recognize, they're either online already or will be very shortly, are Julie Nelson, who's the Calvin Coolidge archivist at the Forbes Library in Northampton. She has been very helpful in us putting on digital library efforts, and we're very excited to welcome her, as well as a relation of President Harding, one of Mr. Pietrusza's 6 presidents of the year 1920. We have Dr. Richard Harding, who will be with us today as well, which is very exciting to note. These digital events were born out of necessity, but we are so glad with how they have turned out ultimately, and growing an online community of people who would not otherwise be able to join us either at the Homestead up in Plymouth Notch or at Coolidge House down in Washington, D.C. has been very special to us. So we're really grateful for this opportunity to meet with you online, and we will have another opportunity to do so a week from today, next Thursday, again at noon. We will hear from historian and author and longtime Coolidge friend Garland Tucker, and I will share more information about that at the end of this program. The Coolidge Foundation has a few other digital opportunities right now. We are building a digital library for President Coolidge. As many of you might know, he's not supported by government funding, and so we rely on private support to build out the preservation of his legacy. We're doing that through 2 ways if you're interested in helping us. We have the opportunity to become a Coolidge volunteer scribe and help us edit documents that go online. And we also have a live GoFundMe campaign, which is another opportunity to give if you would prefer to give financially rather than through editing documents. Our event today is featuring an exciting guest who I will introduce here in just a moment. Longtime Coolidge friend, historian, and author David Pietrusza. And Amity Shlaes, our Coolidge Foundation chair, will be interviewing him, and she will give a full and proper introduction for Mr. Pietrusza in a moment. And after that, they will have an interview for about 20 minutes. And once they're finished with their conversation, we're going to open the floor to questions. We're hoping to get through as many questions as possible, so when you are asking, please limit your question to 60 seconds, and they will try to answer in 2 minutes or less. In order to ask a question, please send me a message through the Zoom chat feature or through my email, and I'll add you to the queue, and when it's your turn to ask a question, we will unmute you and you can ask directly to the speakers. And with that, thank you so much for joining us today. And here you go, Amity.
Good day, how are you all? I had an opportunity to scroll through your faces just now. Can you see mine? Just checking. Cece, can you see me?
Yep.
Yeah. And saw a lot of friends, including I think Sally Harding, and many other familiar names from presidential history land, from economics land, from the state of Vermont. I saw John Dunville, and we're all glad to be together to talk about history. I'm particularly pleased to have as a guest David Pietrusza today. There are authors in history land and there are deans. Dave is like a dean. He's a real authority. His work is fun and accurate, an almost impossible combo. And he ranges all over, always keeping you awake and giving you something new to ponder. He's renowned for his work on American presidential elections. Today, he's talking about his 1920, The Year of 6 Presidents book. And that, of course, is the year when President Coolidge went to Washington, achieved national office, became vice president. One thing I especially liked in this book was the way Dave Pietrusza brought out the young Franklin Roosevelt, which we'll talk about later. The book was honored, this book, The Year of 6 Presidents, was honored by Kirkus as among the best books in the year it came out, 2007. and it was rated among the 5 best books on political campaigns by the Wall Street Journal. Dave has edited multiple volumes on Calvin Coolidge. He is a Coolidge expert. He's a frequent guest on C-SPAN and other media outlets. And I should add, I would be remiss not to, that Dave served as president of the Society for American Baseball Research and is editor-in-chief of the publishing company Total Sports. So please remember to ask something about sports because he'll have a great answer. I'm going to ask 5 or 6 questions of Dave, and then we're going to open it to questions, as Cece said, because this is your event. This is a seminar, not a lecture. The first one is fairly important to us, I would say, Dave. Here we are 100 years later. How was 1920, election year 1920, like today, and how was it different?
Well, you've got some of the same issues. I mean, we're in flu land right now, and we knew we were coming out of it in 1920. We don't know if we're coming out of it or this is the beginning of the story now. We had arguments about where we were in the world in terms of the League of Nations, what our roles would be in regarding our old allies, women's suffrage, prohibition. Now we have issues about, decriminalization of certain substances. And there we were criminalizing the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcohol. So all those things going on, and the country was becoming more rural. Immigration you see in the platforms of the 2 parties as well. And what we're going to do about it, race, there's a difference where the Democrats completely ignore the issue of race in their platform. Republicans are going to call for measures against lynching. So things are the same and things are different. It's sort of that way always in history.
That's wonderful. The title of your book is 6 Presidents.
Yes.
1920, only 2 guys are running. So tell us who your 6 presidents are, who are profiled in this book.
Well, the idea of the book started out as a simple trivia issue as to how many people you could find in the running who became presidents in one election. And in that case, you had Theodore Roosevelt, who would have been the Republican nominee, would have been the president elected in 1920, probably by a big landslide. But he dies in 1919, but he cast a giant shadow. In Woodrow Wilson, people say, well, he was sick in the White House. He wasn't running, but he actually sends his Secretary of State to stampede the Democratic Convention for a 3rd term, unprecedented. Harding is the winner, of course. Calvin Coolidge is the vice presidential candidate. He had been a dark horse favorite son candidate. And Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover, is he a Democrat? Is he a Republican? He's a popular guy back then. He could have run as a Democrat. He wins 2 Democratic primaries. And then Franklin D. Roosevelt, Assistant Secretary of the Navy and Democratic nominee for vice president. So 6 guys, 6 different ideologies, 6 very different personalities, all wrapped up in one election.
And we think our politics are tough and interesting. Who was the guy who was running from jail?
Yes. Talk about lockdown. A lockdown is one thing. Lock up is something else. And the guy who was locked up was Eugene V. Debs. He had run for president 3 times previously on the Socialist Party ticket. Woodrow Wilson's administration jailed him for anti-war, anti-conscription activities in the last days of the war, and they lock him up. He's in Atlanta penitentiary. He's not sending out tweets, but the federal authorities allow him to send out 500 words a week, and he does. When he's notified, they used to have these notification ceremonies. You didn't get the official word at the convention. They came to you a while afterwards, and they come to him, and the newsreel cameras come to him at Atlanta Penitentiary. And he draws nearly 1 million votes that year.
You know, one thing that's interesting about Eugene, Victor, Debs, those of you who have lived in the New York area, there is still a radio station, WEVD, that's for Debs, was that he was quite dignified, and that was part of his comportment. We know that, for example, as a young man, men like Wilkie or Walter Reuther, their parents might take them to meet Debs or to visit the jail where he was sitting. So you want to imagine a man of a, not just a gadfly, but a man with a very serious position protesting World War I, which was, a tough war, running with great dignity from jail. It's interesting, David, that these, am I right? Both these gentlemen are from Ohio.
Yes, the
Harding,
nominee.
so on the one level, you have two guys from a battleground state. It seems to be all about tactics. What were their philosophies? If you would summarize the philosophy of the Democratic Party as led by Cox, and then the Republican Party as led by Warren Harding.
Well, there's two big issues in the election. Well, who's going to be better at fixing the mess that we're in? Because we're in a post-war mess. There's a big dislocation. The economy is bad, and unemployment is up. The cost of living, they never called it inflation back then. It was always the cost of living was up. And how were things going to get fixed? They're kind of similar on prohibition, the parties, but it's not really tending to be an issue until later in the 1920s. And they're similar on immigration, but with there's an old issue which divides them, the tariff. The Republicans are going to raise the tariff again in 1922 or so, but the League of Nations is the big issue. Woodrow Wilson had wanted it. The Republicans didn't want it after a while. There was very divided on that at first. And these two candidates, Warren Gamaliel Harding for the Republicans, James Middleton Cox for the Democrats, both from Ohio, both office holders in the state. Cox was governor, Harding was senator, and they were both newspaper editors, both media guys. Cox is the founder of Cox Media. So you've sort of got twins running that year, and Harding turns out to be the more saleable.
One thing about Harding that's coming into discussion lately, David, has been his use of the term normalcy. You even hear some politicians today saying we've got to get back to normalcy, and also not normality, normalcy, which is a specific Harding word. I'm going to read the Harding quote, and can then you explain, please, what Harding meant by normalcy? Because I don't think they explain that very well in school. Here's the line from the future president, and it's one he more or less repeated as president. Harding said, "America's present need is not heroics, but healing. Not nostrums, but normalcy. Not revolution, but restoration." What do you mean by that?
We'd come off a big period of progressive reform, stretching all the way from TR through Wilson, and the disruption of World War I, the disruption of the economy afterwards, the flu, so things are a mess, and also radicalism in the air, labor unrest, a million of people on strike that year, bombs going off in Wall Street. Also, what he's getting at is he's not going for the big personality. He like Coolidge, is a party person. They believe that the parties should play a big part in governing. It should be a team thing, and it should not be one giant personality. He's referring most to Wilson, but also, coming off of Theodore Roosevelt.
I guess it's less controversial to say I want to go back to American common sense than to say I want to kill the progressives, right?
Well, yeah, you want to build as big a tent as you can get in politics. You don't just want to squeak. If your strategy is to squeak by with 51%, you're going to lose. And Harding does not lose, and he wins big. I mean, he gets over 60% of the vote. That's not exceeded for quite a long time. He's extraordinarily popular that year.
Maybe we could talk for a minute about some of the pieces of legislation that were at issue here. The one I'm thinking of, which I don't know if he's on the line, but we have a friend, Jerry, of the Coolidge Foundation, who often helps with this material. The question is, what is the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, which was one of Harding's first pieces of legislation? You mentioned the tariff. Harding also had a tax law, I believe.
Yeah, I was reading the platforms of the two parties the other day, and the Democrats are criticizing the Republicans for not cutting taxes more previously. They had control of Congress. And the Republicans are playing it very cautiously, and they are not over-promising as to what they are going to do. They're saying it's going to be very hard to get our fiscal books back in balance again. The amazing thing is that with under-promising, they overproduce. They overproduce in the 20s, and they really do get the taxes down, and they get the spending down. The Budget Bureau thing passed before Harding gets in. He has to implement it. He does it with General Dawes, who is going to become Coolidge's vice president in 1924. So they're extremely serious about budget balancing. And, debt. We're piling up massive debt now. We have been for a long time, but certainly in terms of this coronavirus thing. And they were dealing with the massive debt from war. Wars are expensive, as you make the point very often, Amity. And World War I really added in an unprecedented way to our national debt.
Well, what's interesting is they had this approach of under-promising and over-delivering. We see that with earnings seasons with companies all the time now. Under-promise, over-deliver. And
Harding and Coolidge were a buy.
Right. They presented them. I think that was conscious. But a lot of politicians don't work in that way. They will rather over-promise and then try and trigger some anger. So it's not the thing about normalcy is it's not populist, right or left, and that's kind of interesting. It's kind of humdrum, and it's very respectful of business. And of course, I will say that the data suggests the results were pretty good. One of the stories that high schoolers get about history is that it was all fake in the 20s, like a bubble in Gatsby's champagne glass, that it was all speculation. The data belie that. The very strong productivity growth, as we've discussed on another one of our webinars, lots of improvement in the quality of life, low unemployment, strong growth per se, GDP was going up. So why is it that today people are so eager to report the 20s as something worse than they were? I want to mention a truly hostile article that appeared in the Smithsonian this month by Professor Severall with the following headline: Warren Harding tried to return America to normalcy. It failed. Why are historians doing this?
I think they're descendants of the ideologically of the New Deal historians that were so popular when I was growing up. The Leuchtenbergs, Schlesingers, James McGregor Burns, great admirers of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And as the people were making the point for the case for Roosevelt in 32 and 36, it wasn't enough merely to point to your policies, which, as you've explained in The Forgotten Man, were not exactly barn burners in dealing with the great problems of the Depression. It took a long time to solve that, and was really not solved, if you want to call it that, until World War II. But normalcy was, Franklin Roosevelt in 1935 had sort of the same thing. He called it a breathing spell. In other words, you would slow down the process of reform, of confusing the economy, of confusing the society, to, as Coolidge would say, let administration catch up with legislation, to sort things out, to see what's worked and what hasn't worked. And so I think that's the idea behind normalcy. And it does produce it. You may say that the stock market or the prices or the ticker tape is phony or a speculative bubble. But the production in terms of housing and radios and cars and just about every other thing during the 1920s was very real and very much appreciated by the people who lived there, who were the real arbiters and judges of this on the ground. And by the way, that they returned Coolidge in 1924 and gave a big mandate to Hoover in 1928. Unfortunately, he made a few mistakes after that.
No, that's right. And at the Coolidge Foundation, we are now amassing digital images. I see John Clark on the screen right now. There he is. He's putting on, if you toggle through, you might be able to see him, his hat, which says Coolidge again. He's digitizing some of his prodigious presidential paraphernalia collection. And right next to him is John Dunville, who was the keeper of much Coolidge material for the state of Vermont for many years. So, and we also have an artist actually drawing pictures of the economy of the 20s for our Coolidge exhibits. You can kind of see what they were talking about and how Americans were enjoying the improvement in the quality of living. I have a question for you, since we're the Coolidge Foundation and we always favor Coolidge, maybe too much. What did Coolidge learn from Harding?
Coolidge, I think, knew a lot about governance even before he teamed up with Harding, but they got along very well. One of the things which happens and doesn't happen in that campaign, the thing that doesn't happen is this. Franklin D. Roosevelt asks his running mate, Mr. Cox, whether he can sit in on cabinet meetings, which had never been done before. And Cox says, no, you can't. You can't, Franklin Roosevelt. But Harding brings it up, I think, of his own volition to Coolidge, that yes, you can be part of the governing team. You cannot just be some guy sitting out there in the corner like, Vice President Marshall under Woodrow Wilson. So there is, even though they are very disparate personalities, they are united ideologically. And you see in Coolidge's autobiography that he speaks really of Harding, I think, even as a friend, which is pretty strong language for Coolidge, who doesn't, as they say, gush over people.
Well, that's right. And Henry Cabot Lodge, this important senator from the state of Massachusetts, treated Coolidge pretty poorly. And so he knew what it was like, senior senator. He knew what it was like to be treated poorly by a fellow politician, and Harding was the opposite. And Coolidge noticed. We have several Hardings in our audience, and we're going to give them pride of place in the question period, and it won't be long before we get there. Just a couple more questions, and for David. What surprised you in researching this book and these characters? You have 6 of them. What surprised you?
One of the things that surprised me was what a good politician Warren Harding was, because, okay, so we're coming off the progressive era, and what happened there? The Republican Party splits wide open. It doesn't get put back together in 1916, and that's why Woodrow Wilson is narrowly reelected, in part. And it is split much more so than the Democratic Party over the League of Nations, which is the big issue that year. You've got people who want to get involved in the League of Nations, like Taft and Hoover and other people, the progressives like Bora and Hiram Johnson, who will take a walk unless you cut the League of Nations dead. And Harding has to walk that line, and he brings everybody in the Republican Party back together. And that's not easy. And he does it and makes it look like it's not even heavy lifting.
Wow. It does, and we'll just ask one last question. Does any of this have to do with baseball?
Well, there is, when Yes, Harding had the front porch campaign. Harding was very, he was very kind, like McKinley. And like McKinley, he has a front porch campaign, and people come in, 600,000 people pile into Marion, Ohio to hear him talk. And among the groups is he wanted to bring the Chicago Cubs in to play an exhibition game. The PR guy for the Republican Party that year was Albert Lasker. Lasker was a part owner of the Chicago Cubs. Now, eventually, the Cubs got, kind of cold feet, and so they brought in a couple of local teams to play an exhibition game. Harding gives, if people had a problem with Harding's rhetoric with normalcy, he gave an incredibly hokey speech tying in baseball and all these metaphors to the great games of politics in America at that point. But going back, as they say in baseball, to the fence, Warren Harding was also involved in baseball professionally, not like Dwight Eisenhower playing under an assumed name, but as part owner of the Marion minor league baseball team.
Well, it wouldn't be an American story without that. Cece, I'd like to give pride of place to Dr. Harding and any other Hardings. Did I see the name Sally Harding somewhere? Who are here to ask the first question, and maybe say something for a minute or two, and then we'll turn it open to questions for David. So Dr. Harding, is that you in the white shirt? I can't hear you though. I think you need to
unmute. Unmute.
I'm sorry.
Oh, we got you now.
Yep.
It's tough to get these crystal sets working.
Yeah, there's some early things that Harding did back then.
Thank you.
The first rounds. Well, I'm delighted to be here. The first thing, thank you for inviting me, Amity, and very pleased, and what a wonderful occasion. And this is a book that I read a long time ago, and I enjoy reading still. The Six Presidents. Just a couple things that I would say. I am the grandnephew of President Harding. His only brother was my grandfather. So that's how I get into this line here a little bit. But and I grew up in Ohio, and I think one of the things that David was talking about was that Harding could get along. And that's a necessary thing in Ohio. Because Ohio is 50-50, Democrats and Republicans. And it's a state that was heavily German, almost 50% German there at the time of the war. So there were lots of people who weren't real pleased about going in on the side of the British and so forth in 1916 or whatever. So politicians, the only thing in Ohio that everybody agrees on is Ohio State football. Everything else is separate. And so a politician has to walk the middle line and get along, or he's out. So Harding, from an early time, learned how to do that, and I think it served him well as he brought people in and brought them together back at that crucial time. It was a crucial time. Just a couple of things from family, legends and passed downs and so forth. TR had done initial discussions with Harding and his allies about being his vice president and wanted Harding, he said, to be his vice president. He said, of course, Harding. And of course, then that didn't turn out. Other things, a couple things that are kind of interesting to me, the smoke-filled room. And that he was just a out of the blue kind of candidate. My grandfather was a physician, but an ill man. He had rheumatic fever when he was young and had a heart condition. And so was not a traveler and was not well much of the time. And he didn't have a lot of money. And the convention was being held in Chicago. And he, about 3 weeks before the convention, he went up to his brother and said, we'd like to be there if this is an important day in your life and the family's life, but I can't afford it, and I don't know that I can handle the physical exertion. And should we come to Chicago or should we not? Of course, it's obvious, you know, are you going to be the president elect or whatever or not? And Harding waited about 3 or 4 seconds and thought about it. And he said, I think you ought to come to Chicago. So 3 weeks out, he was pretty sure that things were going to work out. Whereas most people think that that was something that happened that night in a smoke-filled room. And of course, then the story about how Coolidge was just hit the spot right at that right time, right afterwards, and he was unanimously brought forward. And then great with Harding. He thought he was a great person and had the right credentials and so forth. But I enjoy listening, and I don't have a great deal to say, but I'd be glad to comment on anything or answer a question. But I'm really better about family than I am about politics.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. We're going to come back to you, but we'd like to open it to Cece, will you open it to questions to Dave and also to Dr. Harding?
You got it. So our first question is up from John Clark, one of our on-site election historians.
Okay. First of all, David, thank you for writing this book. I think the elections of 20 and 24 are among the most interesting, and it's the ones I specialize in collecting. But the question I had was, and I reread the book yesterday to have it fresh in my mind. Presidents usually draw on their predecessors' knowledge and experience. Just about all of them have reached back to previous presidents. But you said that FDR and Hoover, even though they seemed friendly and respectful of each other, never saw each other again in person after Roosevelt's inauguration day. And I just wondered maybe why that was. Did they have any contact, do you think?
Well, actually,
Nice hat.
I see your hat and raise your hand.
Mine came from Plymouth Notch, the gift shop there too.
Okay. So I usually don't wear a hat indoors, but I couldn't resist. And it's after Memorial Day. So, but the answer is there's a precedent. Well, no, I don't think they had any contact, and they were both, you know, Hoover was not exactly a happy warrior in that. But the precedent for Roosevelt not consulting with a predecessor goes back to Al Smith, where Smith thought he could give a lot of advice to Roosevelt, and the call never comes. And that is one of the things which causes the Smith-Roosevelt breakup. So that's really what's going on there. That Roosevelt is, well, look at his speeches. You know, we're going to break precedent. He's always about breaking precedent. He's always about experimentation. So for him to rely on someone from the past, even if it was just the other administration before him, no, he's just not that into it. A guy who does seem to rely on advice from his predecessor is Coolidge. Coolidge seems to rely on he seems to talk to Taft a lot. You know, even Taft being on the Supreme Court, you know, you go to him and I think Taft got smarter politically the older he got, as so many of us do. And so his advice tended, I think, to be very, very good. And Coolidge would rely on him. What Dr. Harding was saying was, I think, very true also, talking about predecessors, Harding and Roosevelt. And I go into that in some more detail in my latest book, which is about Theodore Roosevelt. And that, again, is about how Harding can bring people together. Harding rarely bashed people, but he went after Theodore Roosevelt, with hammer and tongs. in 1910 and 1912. And he was able to kiss and make up very, very well with Theodore Roosevelt in the last year or so of Roosevelt's life. And I really do think you could have seen a Roosevelt Harding ticket, which of course meant that neither one of those guys would have been alive at the end of their term. So the president might have been Guy Gillette or whatever, not Guy Gillette, but the fellow who was Speaker of that, no, the Secretary of State. It might have ended up, whoever Roosevelt would have been appointing as Secretary of State. It might have been a very old Elihu Root. Yes.
All right, next up, asking a question is Abbie Minard. And just as a reminder, you can ask questions to me via the Zoom chat feature or by email, and I'll get you added to the list. So Abbie, you are up.
Sure. Hi, I just wanted to say thanks for the presentation. Also, you might remember me from a handful of years ago. I'm not really active on Twitter anymore, but I was Abbie Coolidge on Twitter.
I certainly do.
I'm now graduating from college, so it's been, with a degree in history.
Right.
And so my question is sort of related to that. I just finished writing an undergraduate senior thesis, so I wanted to ask about the historical writing process for you, particularly the book you're speaking about today. You finished in 2007. Do you feel your argument has changed or evolved at all since then, or your understanding of the subject has changed? And then similarly, when do you know that a book is ready to go or finished? And I'd be interested to hear Amity's thoughts too.
The process. No, I think that the various theses of that book have held up fairly well. And because, now you see such a flood of material online where it's almost like a question of too much candy. It's like, what do I choose from to put in this book and leave out? But nothing is really challenged, anything in there. I could think of a couple other books where, okay, maybe I should have had a different viewpoint or something like that, but not here. The writing process, when do you know it's ready? When you're under contract, the date on that contract is a really solid hint, okay? And a book like that, normally it's an 18-month process. 6 months is solid research, and I can't even start to put something down. Now, everyone works differently, okay? But for me, it's like research, and it's exhausting. And then you're going to see the words come out because you've got enough behind you where when it starts to flow, the dam bursts. And then there's 6 months of writing. So a book like this is only 6 months, but 6 months of editing.
Yeah.
Editing, because my first book was a little book on baseball, and I thought I might have to self-publish it. And back then it was much harder, and I would have to print them all up, no print on demand, and I would have to pay for all of my words. And if I had to pay for them, I thought in very Coolidge-like fashion, are they all wonderful? Not if I have to pay for them. So I cut 25% of them out. And I think it was a better process. And it's cut, and maneuver to get the words in the proper sentences, the phrases. And it's not just getting the facts out. You've got to be able to tell that story so people want to read it. So Amity,
I'll just say very briefly, it's all about audience. Who are you trying to reach? And what are you offering audience? A second point is no book is ever the truth. It's just the truth of what we know so far, right?
Yeah.
What is coming with presidents, and presidential history is very perilous because somebody somewhere knows something you don't. Yeah. So it's risky. So that you just do the best you can and know it'll be imperfect. Next question, please.
You got it. Next up is from John Hillston. Should be unmuted and ready to go.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for holding this. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. My question, I saw that you've been associated with the Siena survey, David.
Yeah.
And it, I look at these things out of interest. Is it possible for someone who's humble and conservative to get a fair shake out of that? The tendency is, of course, for this action bias, but action isn't always necessarily good action. And then, of course, there's some alternatives. Richard Vedder from Ohio U and Ivan Eland. Any thoughts on those? So thank you for.
Well, I'm not familiar with those two fellows you just cited.
Okay.
But most of the historians are very, very liberal, and
Right.
I've stuck my nose into the tent of a couple historical societies recently, and it's more so than I had imagined, actually. What I find interesting about these surveys is, first off, they are incredibly, they're worse than your tax forms. It's like it goes on and on forever on subset of this and that. Now, they say answer the questions that you're most familiar with about the presidents. Nobody is an expert on Franklin Pierce and Harry Truman, or you just don't know them all. You know a little bit about them all, but you don't know to drill down on those subsets. Americans love lists, but I'm not quite sure how helpful they are. In fact, the last time I was asked to participate in Siena's survey, I just said to myself, the hell with it, and didn't even submit it. I didn't even submit it because I really don't find the exercise even that helpful. There, I said it.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, our next question is going to come from Logan Lyon. And there we go.
Hey there. First off, thanks for putting this on. And building off of what John just said, one thing that, I learned a lot about a quiet, humble president by reading Amity's book on Coolidge. I really enjoyed that. I learned a lot about a person who's kind of hard to learn about in a lot of circles. So I appreciate that. For David, first off, thanks for tweeting about this. That's how I found out about it. I follow you on Twitter, and I had the time to hop in here, so I appreciate that. My question is probably one you've answered a lot lately, but it's the best question I could come up with right now. Is what was the federal government's reaction to the Spanish flu, and was there any difference between the parties on the response to that? Did it change? The federal government change with the change in administrations? And how does that response differ with what we see today and how the federal government has grown?
Well, oddly enough, there's a similarity. Even though the federal government is doing a lot more today, and certainly with these $1 trillion packages and supplying ventilators and all that, the main response to contagion control is on the ground. It was the cities more than the states. The states did not have big health departments then. So the cities were the ones telling you to wear a mask or closing down the theaters. It wasn't so much the governors. So it was more, shall we say, Jeffersonian back then. The federal government was working with the war, and the federal government was in part causing the epidemic by moving soldiers around all the time. At one point, one of the doctors went to Woodrow Wilson and said, should we stop shipping around 6 soldiers in these massive ships to Europe, and just they're all going to be infected when they get there? And he's like, no, the war must go on. The war must go on. Some scholars think Wilson had the flu, but I think this is not the case. Franklin Roosevelt had the flu, and that had major league repercussions because it led to Eleanor finding some correspondence he had with Lucy Mercer. Okay, so that was one of the big unintended consequences of the flu pandemic. But the federal government doesn't do as much in terms of impacting the election. The third wave which is really the second wave in terms of impact, is pretty much over by 1920. So it's low. There's more of an impact on the 1918 election, and that is an impact almost very negatively on Coolidge, where Coolidge finds the voting goes down in Massachusetts, and he should have won by, in a walk for the governorship, and he doesn't. It's very close. History could have been very different that way as well. So thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for that question. And I'll just quickly note that last week, our webinar featured our colleague, Jared Rhodes, who did a presentation on Calvin Coolidge and his response to the 1918 flu epidemic. We recorded it, and it's available on our YouTube channel. So if anyone else is interested in the parallels between the present and 1918, I'll definitely help you get linked up with that. We have 4 more questions that we'll hope to get to before our hour is over. And our next is from Xavier Ballesteros.
Yes, hello, good afternoon. My question is, okay, I get the point that Harding is not a very strong personality like Theodore Roosevelt or Wilson, but he is a charming person. He has a very powerful voice. So my question is, does it really make much sense from a campaign point of view, from a strategic point of view, to leave a person like Harding at his front porch in Ohio, at the same time having somebody that's known to be Silent Cal to go around the country doing speeches? So that was my question.
Interesting point. Well, sometimes you want to play it safe in politics, and the number of speeches which people would give in a campaign were much less back then. Franklin Roosevelt, even as president, will sometimes sort of play possum. He won't be on the air, shall we say, all the time talking politics. Hoover only wants to go out 7 or 8 times as president in 1932. Presidents didn't go out much. Candidates tended to go out more. James M. Cox is absolutely frenetic as a campaigner. He's sort of like Brian. The message seems to be, or the wisdom then, is that being too frenetic can be a negative. Think of William Jennings Bryan going all around the country and talking to everyone, and it never turns into actual votes. And McKinley, that worked. Wilson was going to kind of stay low in 1916 quite a bit. But with Coolidge staying home, yes. And Coolidge resists the entreaties of the Republican establishment, of the Republican National Committee, to go on the road. He says, I'm the governor of Massachusetts. I've got stuff to do. Beat it. I don't want to do it. And when he does go out, they send him to states which are, well, they send him to the South. They send him to Virginia. They send him to like Tennessee or Kentucky, states which are not exactly crucial. And they send him to New York City, which is like, hello, that's Republican. It's not going to turn out to be Republican in 1920, where the Republicans carry New York City, but they don't know that. That's the great thing about history. You know some of the answers afterwards, but they don't know that then. And Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, is again like campaigning all over the country. So it's a real study in contrasts of these people running around, flailing their arms almost as candidates, being too frantic on the Democratic side and calm, cool on the other side. If you want to say the country's going back to normalcy, I guess you have to act calm and cool. But Harding does go on the campaign trail. It's often misunderstood. After a while, that act gets kind of old, and they put him out And he does dozens of speeches, largely in the Midwest. He does a lot of speeches, and I think he does a lot in Oklahoma for some reason. Yeah, he's capable of doing that. He made, when I visited Marion, I said, how do they, the Hardings traveled a lot. How did they afford that? And the docent said, well, a lot of his income came from speaking on the Chautauqua circuit. So he was, even though H.L. Mencken and historians have said, boy, that guy was stinko as a public speaker, that's not what the opinion was at the time. People paid money to hear him, as they often did for a lot of political speakers. Eugene V. Debs would raise a lot of money. You would pay to see a campaign speech by Eugene V. Debs.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Next question is coming from Bobby Konis. Bobby, you still seem to be muted. All right, Bobby, we will return to you after our next question, see if we can get that working. James George, you are up.
Well, hello, David. Hello, Amity. Big fan of both of your books, but I kind of want to ask a question about 1920 and some of the results from that. So we know that Harding and Coolidge both did very well with ethnic Catholics in big cities in the Northeast and in the Midwest. And you also mentioned Coolidge campaigning down South. This was, really a first for Republicans. I know Harding one time later on in the presidency even went down to Birmingham, Alabama. So you see the Republicans starting to move down South. My question is, why were they moving into these areas that weren't really Republican groups and would go very wildly Democratic in the New Deal era?
What, you mean later on or in that year?
Both before and after.
Well, I think they're still appealing to ethnic groups. The real ethnic breakaway from the Democratic Party, I saw a stat a couple weeks ago, and it said, take a look at the age cohorts in the cities and what percentage of these people were foreign born and how they all come of age. It's a question of them coming of age in the New Deal. So it's almost like a natural thing, but that is certainly accelerated by Al Smith. Al Smith is the breakthrough guy. Al Smith, while getting clobbered in most of the country, carries Catholic Rhode Island and, most ominously, Coolidgean Massachusetts, and they're not going to leave. Another group which is going to be changing in the years to come is blacks. Sean Trenn makes the point that the change in the South starts as early as 1936. Okay, I mean, it doesn't flip over, but you see the inklings of it's changing, and it's not based on race, it's based on urbanization. It's that things are becoming a little more up to date in the South, a little more sophisticated, and the old ways are changing. The blacks are shifting the other way, but they're still going to hold for Hoover in 1932. They flip in 36, and again, Sean Trenn says it's a question of age. It's that the older blacks still stick with the Republicans in 1936, but the younger ones, many of whom were getting jobs with the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, or the WPA, the Public Works Projects, are going to flip for Roosevelt because you can't shoot Santa Claus. Okay.
That's great. And now to round out our conversation today, we have a question from Stephen Shipman.
Thank you, CC and Amity, for another wonderful show. David, I had to ask a baseball question, and I'll give you my biases. I'm a native Californian and have familial ties to the San Francisco Seals. So my question is, what was the perception in the 20s of the Pacific Coast League? And if you were to speculate, would Major League Baseball have moved west earlier if we didn't have the Depression and the World War II interrupting.
The Pacific Coast League was almost like a third major league. There were players who, and of course they were not farm teams of the major leagues, which is why Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio in as late as the 30s have to be sold as independent transactions from the club owners on the coast to the major league owners. And the war holds up all kinds of things. The Depression holds up all kinds of things. There's an early Coolidge column in his newspaper column talking about how television is on the way. And that of course gets held up by both of those two things. But baseball, yes, I think that baseball was, the St. Louis Browns were going to move to the coast in the 1940s, but that is held up because of the war. People just can't move around then. But yeah, the world is very different then, and California very isolated and travel very isolated, and of course the politics being very different then, where the often the more what used to be the more conservative West was very radical and progressive, particularly the upper Midwest. North Dakota was like, on fire, prairie populism. But yeah, baseball and the PCL.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you to everyone who joined us today and who asked questions. We are so grateful for all of your participation and engagement with this series of digital events. Our next webinar will take place a week from today on June 3rd. That will also be at noon. We will hear from speaker Garland Tucker. He's a friend of the Coolidge Foundation. He's a historian and a writer. He has written on the 1924 election, as well as on a number of biographical histories in his book, The Conservative Heroes. So I will include information on that in my follow-up email to all of you. And just a few quick reminders as we close out today. Coolidge is not funded by the government. He would be glad not to accept federal funds, even though that might make things easier sometimes. So we have a few ways to get involved if you would like to help keep our little foundation going. If you'd like to volunteer your time as a Coolidge scribe to contribute to our digital library, we would certainly love your help with that. We also welcome you to give to our live GoFundMe campaign. That's to produce a digital library for Calvin Coolidge. He doesn't have an official presidential library by the government, and so we're hoping to build one for him online. Information about those opportunities, as well as upcoming webinars, both next Thursday and beyond, will be sent out via email on our Facebook. And I especially want to encourage you all to sign up for our News from the Notch newsletter. We send out updates regularly on events in person and online, as well as different efforts that we have going on. I know we have a lot of new faces today. Thank you to those who joined us via Twitter. If you learned about us through Amity's or David's postings, we're certainly glad to have you all with us. And we'd love to have you with us and continue to participate in our events in the future. So thank you all again, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.